We may have to shorten a little bit of the presentations. This session is being recorded, which means I have to watch my potty mouth as well as the rest of my co-chairs. So I'm Stephanie Scott. I'm from Columbia University.
I'm Amanda Humphrey. I'm from Harvard University.
And I'm Amanda Haymaker from Purdue University.
All right, so let's get started for the agenda today. We have four main things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to kick it off with a discussion on copyright language that is currently in the templates. Then we're going to go into the subword template working group discussion. The theme of today is discussions. Really heavy, controversial, knock you down discussions. So if anyone has experience as a bouncer, I could use one in the middle and one in the back, because it's going to come in handy. Then we're going to have our working group updates, and there's actually a lot more working groups than you even see on this slide. There are so many wonderful volunteers that work to help the subaward subcommittee on a variety of things. We'll give an update. And then finally, I know what you've all been waiting for, the preliminary results of the Carry Me Over the Threshold survey. So let's go into this lovely thing, copyright. So let me just first get a show of hands. How many have been paying attention to the discussions and the suggestions made on the subawards listserv about this issue? I want to get a show of hands. Okay, it's very important why I'm asking this question, because those that receive email updates on that listserv, sometimes they're the administrative reps, sometimes it's individuals that are working, actually issuing the subawards, which is, I believe, the bulk of it. And so this is a big communication issue where we are proposing different ideas and having discussion that really we encourage you to flow these emails and forward them to the folks within your institutions that need to weigh in, such as your general counsels, such as your tech transfer offices, such as your supervisors. So we want to ensure the communication is flowing. So let's talk about what this issue is. What you see right here on the screen is the current language that is now in our subawards templates that's causing a bit of a stir right now. And the background on this is that I would say over the last 6-7 months, we've been getting a ton of calls about lengthy negotiations where a subrecipient will insist on shall grant, the pass-through entity is insisting on grants, and the language is not new. This has actually been around for a long, long time, but it's getting renewed interest. We're not sure if it's because of the reiteration of the templates that happened in September, but it's a new called out interest in this. So I'm not going to read what it says on this slide, but I want to call out certain things here. So in red, the subrecipient has the option of having grants versus shall grants to the pass-through entity and irrevocable royalty-free, yada, yada, yada. You can read the rest of it. I bolded first developed and delivered under this subaward agreement for the purpose of and only to the extent required to meet the pass-through entity's obligation to the federal government. And so, going on to the next slide, let's talk about what this means. And we get this question a lot. What is the difference between grants and shall grant? And so grants, present assignment. What we're talking about is that the subrecipient, upon the execution of that subaward, they are granting the copyright to the pass-through entity and copyright materials right up front. At that point in time to the pass-through entity. But the shall grant is a future assignment where the subrecipient grants the copyright at a later date. And so the arguments that I've been hearing on both sides of the coin, and I'm summarizing these arguments. As you can imagine, some of these arguments are going on for months at a time. But really the pass-through entity is saying, wait a minute, what's this shall grant business? I need it now, not later. How can I ensure that I'm going to meet the requirements of the sponsor? Are you really going to issue separate licenses to me? Is that what I can expect? And how can we close this endless loop? Whereas the subrecipient says, hey, I can't grant it to you now or even ever because I don't have the signature authority to do so. And wait a minute, have you not gotten what you needed anyway? Have you really ever had a problem in the past if I selected shall grant? I mean, what does that mean to you? If I select shall grant as a subrecipient, is it really holding things up for you? Are you really not getting what you need to meet the obligations of the federal government? And also as a subrecipient, I might say, hey, look, separate licenses aren't necessary, and we'll issue them if we really need to. So how do we solve this issue with these arguments? And how can, in our role, what we're looking to do is decrease the length of time that you're having these negotiations. We want to clarify these issues for you. And how can we solve it so that we're reducing burden and time? And so this is what's coming out of the discussions. And keep in mind, this language, like we said, it was written long ago to deal with the fact that different institutions are structured in very different ways, and not all subrecipients, sponsored projects offices have that signature authority to grant right up front that assignment of copyright licenses right up front. And so there may be another legal entity that is the one authorized to sign IP provisions. So it could be a separate legal entity, in which case the shall grant works better for those subrecipients in those institutions. And something that we've been playing around with the listserv is different language. And we've been collecting language from you, suggested language, to share with the rest of you to get your comments and for you to share it with your general counselors and your tech transfer offices. And so one suggestion was, in a case where a subrecipient does not have the authority to sign, was to put subrecipient grants or will cause its designee to grant without execution of any further document to the pass-through entity, blah, 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 blah. And then we have the rest of the language. The other issue concerning copyrights. So issue number one, it's who has the authority to sign it at that point in time when the subaward is being fully executed. Keep in mind, for those subrecipients that really have separate legal entities, for the one that's authorized to sign and one that isn't, well, think about the burden that would be caused if that if the sponsored projects offices then had to go to another office to get an additional signature on the subaward to sign it. So it's not that simple. It's not that simple to sign this, to solve this problem. So the second issue with copyright. So first we have who is able to sign it up front. And then the second one was the language itself first developed, and what does that mean? And what we've heard from the community and from others is that developed is really broad. It's intellectual property bleeding into all different areas. And so tech transfer offices may be the only ones authorized to sign just by that word developed, because it's such a broad word, including all intellectual property, that they may be the only ones authorized to sign at the time the subaward is being executed. So one possible solution that was also given to us, which I've actually gotten a lot of positive feedback so far, is changing that to created, and the definition, which I got from the FAQs of copyright.gov, is fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So it's the recorded in a physical medium. It's narrowing the scope to give the pass-through entity what they need. Now, the original language concerning developed and why it was there in the templates, we believe, was coming down from the original A110, slightly revised when uniform guidance came out, and it's 200.315B, in case you're interested in looking at that. But that word developed is in there, not talking about pass-through entities, but talking about what non-federal entities owe the federal government. And so we think, even though this language does not mirror exactly what it says in uniform guidance, this is the subrecipient to pass-through entity relationship that we're talking about, where we can narrow this scope to create it. So I know I said a mouthful here. But going on to my next slide, which is now the discussion and the brawl, which is this. As a group, let's think about this. Now, what I want to say, what happened there? What happened there? Okay. We're back to the Hyatt Regency. Okay, so first of all, I think we agree, the co-chairs agree, we don't want to rush into making a final decision on this. And we really want you to vet this through your institutions about possible language options, about alternatives, and discuss it through. So we want to leave the comment period open on this topic. I would say at least till the end of the month, and we're not in a rush because if we decide to change language in the templates, the next version of the templates will be in September, so we have time to work this out. And so ultimately, the question is, what are our solutions? Should we revise the language and continue to tweak it till we find something that is acceptable? Or perhaps maybe we should issue more guidance on this topic, FAQs, because maybe shall grant, when we really understand it, is okay for pass-through entities to accept. And so what I want to have in this discussion, especially I want to hear from the pass-through entity perspective, is why shall grant is not acceptable to you if you've never had issues with it before. So if anybody wants to chime in, go ahead, start the brawl. Yep.
The license granted is limited to the purposes of the grant, so it's very narrow. It's not a wide one. It's you're granting granting rights to the copyright to fulfill what we need to do for the feds. So shall is a subjunctive, like forward-looking, conditional grant. We should get rid of it because, it's too circular. We will not shall grant. We have to grant. Otherwise, we've got a gap in our legal, overview of the relationship. So just cut out shall, and remember that the license is very limited. And copyright is not IP in the first instance. Copyright is the form and the physical sense of the data as presented. So I think we're making a hell of a lot of, something out of nothing here. Myself. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I think for me and our institution, this came about as a result of thinking about the SEC template and all the changes that have happened and thinking about all of the aspects of the SEC template and what could make it better. And having an option where you are selecting one of two things leads to confusion, leads to different parties thinking differently about the options and what they mean. And when I talked to various entities, they all had a slightly different take on what shall actually meant and grants actually meant. So I thought this is a great opportunity to get together and say this is what it actually means, and we all think the same way. And I just feel the same way about shall, is that it's just illogical. How does it actually work in practice? If this is, you've been getting these copyrightable works all along as a PTE and delivering them up to the federal government as if you did have that license, and nothing actually happened where someone gave you an extra license or executed something else. It seems like the grants actually in practice has been happening. And the shall just worries me that one day someone might say, I can hold something back from you and put extra terms and conditions around it.
And I think that's the fear that I keep hearing, is that it's that slight possibility, if you have the shall in there, that you're possibly not going to get what you need. But is anyone else? How about the folks, if you're, yep, go ahead.
Okay, so from our standpoint, this goes back to the intellectual property policy that we have in place at our institution, and whether our faculty members are agreeing that they shall in the future grant us IP, or whether they have perfected that. Okay, it's this present versus future condition. Our current IP policy pushes it to be a future shall grant. Okay, like it's as a condition of that, that relationship. You're working for our institution, and you shall grant us. Any IP you create, you shall perfect that assignment. But if we say grants, then I would think we would have to perfect that assignment at the time we're signing as the subrecipient for you as a pass-through entity. And we're trying to get that pushed into the employment agreements with our faculty members. That's currently underway, but this is another feature. It's not that we don't have the legal authority to sign it, but we haven't perfected that assignment with our faculty member.
I've heard that too, where upon employment, sometimes they don't grant it to the university up front, which then it flows down to this.
It's a shall grant as opposed to a grant.
We have time for maybe one or two.
Oh, we got, how about Mike in the back?
Hi, Mike from the University of California. There was a comment talking about sort of the limited scope of what we're talking about in the first place, and I think we can see that. I think the large issue to us has always been the structural issue and how delegations of authority work. And with a really good scope of work, if you really identify the type of rules that you have, that can be overcome some of the concerns about closing authority.
Can I go back to that, the cause program?
Yeah.
So then, it sounds like there is some room for some institutions where the shall grant is still something that really needs to be considered. So is the possible solution the subrecipient grants or will cause its designee to grant without execution of any further document? Because I think a lot of what people are pushing back on in the shall grants is how are we going to close the loop? How are we going to figure this out? As opposed to saying, I want to know that I've got it now, or that if it's not, that assignment isn't perfected at the time of signature, that this is going to be done without me having to step back in and come back to you and ask further questions.
Is that implying that if you don't have signature authority to do a license at your institution, that then you have to create a procedure where it's going to your tech transfer office and they're agreeing to the contract? Is that implying that we have to create a new process?
I don't know. I think that would depend on how the institutional procedures would work for your institution. One of the things that we had discussed with one of the general counsels during one of our calls was that there's the difference between developed and created. So created is that fixed tangible form that's going to be the subrecipient reporting back to their PTE, or creating something that like a journal article that's in that fixed tangible form, as opposed to developed. They felt that there was some room there for something more along the lines of software or a database or something where it's an iterative process. So you're not just creating something in one fixed tangible form. It's built on something else that then maybe you don't have the rights to be able to transfer those to somebody else, or it adds another complicating factor. So I think as far as the particular general counsel that we spoke with at that point in time, their feeling was that if we did the created, that would somewhat limit the scope of what might need to get transferred to the IP office, because we've narrowed the scope of it to basically include what is just general reports.
Yep. That's you.
Yep. Go ahead.
You.
Yeah.
I have a question about what you just said, and that would be, if it were changed to creative, would it still meet the requirements of the uniform guidance and what you passed through into the
Would it still meet the requirements of the non-federal entity to meet to the federal government per the uniform guidance?
Yeah. And the other question I have is, roll in any order, is has anyone here ever had somebody come back and say, have you ever had to pursue getting the approval for the shall grant? Like you signed it, it said shall grant, and you needed it, and you had to go ask for something. Or does everybody just assume that they signed it with shall grant? You don't have to do anything with it.
Does anyone want to respond to that particular? Okay.
I mean, I've never seen a license agreement for these things. So how does it actually work is the question.
Right. So, I mean, we've had discussions about that. So, would a separate license need to be issued? Has anyone actually seen a separate copyright license issued? Would that be expected? And so the answer, and also in our discussions, would be no. It's not necessary. The subrecipient would let the pass-through entity know if there is a separate license that's necessary. So part of the discussions we were having is that once that subrecipient is giving like a progress report or a journal article to the pass-through entity, there you go. That's your license. It's been met to meet the needs of the federal government. When they're giving it to them, that's it. But if there's something separate from that that might be derivative, like software, then that is where something might need a separate license.
Yes, Laura.
So that's kind of where my question comes in here. Could we just clarify the shall grant to the point at which it becomes effective? So like shall grant upon creation or something like that, so people know the point at which the copyright is granted. Because right now it doesn't give you a time frame, it just says shall grant. That doesn't tell you when it's going to be granted, it doesn't give you any information. So there is a dispute. You don't really have like a stand on it. If you put shall grant upon creation without requirement of without additional documentation, then they automatically know that upon creation they are granted.
Shall grant upon creation. Yep.
How often has this been a problem for anybody?
Yeah, that's the that's the ultimate question.
Where's the ultimate answer?
Yeah.
So one thing, we'll take your question in a second, but I just want to cite the language says, the non-federal entity may copyright any work that is subject to copyright and was developed or for which ownership was acquired under a federal award. That does not say the pass-through entity. It says the non-federal entity. So one of the questions that I think Stephanie and I started talking about yesterday was, is that more expansive than to say any non-federal entity under that particular federal award, then this right is kind of automatically granted back to the federal government.
Yeah.
So first we had that question back there that I had promised.
Yeah, just a quick response to what you said. I think with uniform guidance, one of the things that the spirit of it is flexibility. So I think many of us have been, embracing that flexibility. So
Sure.
I would encourage that flexibility and the interpretation of that. But I think the other thing to kind of remember with this language is that it says and delivered. So again, we're talking about things that you created or whatever word you'd like to use, but it's and delivered to them. And I think in the context of the policies and regulations that apply already to that that mechanism, those things are covering whatever issues you may have. And so maybe this is, I kind of agree with Dick, maybe this is an argument that's not as critical as we may think. If we're talking about, in many cases we've already given it to them, whatever the required deliverables are. I think the and delivered is an important piece of that. So it may mitigate the issue that we think we may have with the future versus present tense granting.
Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah, that's a simple way to close the loop. So it could be, would it be that we add in there and delivered, created and delivered, and issue additional guidance on what that means, right? And
So
delivered,
it would be
right?
guidance on what and delivered means then.
So it could be that we keep the shall, but provide guidance on what that means to make the pass-through entities feel better and understand that it's covered and that it's really not a non-issue. It's really not an issue. But I'd like to keep the comment period a little bit more open on this to flesh through different alternatives until we come up with something that we all agree upon. But just from a quick show of hands, if we kept the shall grant, would you be okay with just more explanations and guidance and FAQs on this matter? No one's raising their hands. And so there's an interest in that. Okay, I'm not saying this is a done deal by any means because we need some more discussion on it, and I know that we have a ton more to also go on today's agenda, so we got to move on. But again, let's keep the comment period open on this. I think what we'll do today is, we'll write a summary notes, and we have the video that will be posted on this topic, and then we'll discuss some next steps on the listservs, and then have a deadline for when the comment period is over. How does that sound? Yep, one more.
I'll just make a comment. This is an opportunity for all of us at our institutions to get behind uniform guidance in this vein and say that we all agree that the intent is to, by delivery, grant that license and be done with it. To do anything else at this point is to do the opposite of what we're all pushing uniform guidance to do in terms of Implementation in terms of interpretation, and in terms of taking a stand when an auditor asks that question. FAQs are great, educate our technical folks, and let's move on.
All right.
Uh-oh, I just dropped
We're
something.
moving on. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, so template. We got a lot of really great feedback from the community at large, and so we have a lot of things that we have been working through. There were a couple of things that we felt like were very important to bring back to this group and make sure that we were thinking the right things in terms of some of these changes. So one of the issues that keeps coming up in this group and in many other forums is invoicing, timeliness, carryover. Those are all things that we keep coming back to, we keep talking about. So as we think about the face page on the cost reimbursable FDP subaward template, the current language in term 2 says the PTE shall reimburse the subrecipient not more often than monthly for allowable costs. It doesn't say anything about how often the subrecipient is going to submit invoices, and it doesn't give any clarity around the right to reject invoices, timeliness, etc. The actual citation about the reserving the right to reject an invoice is actually in term 4. As one of the commenters pointed out to me when they actually asked me to move what is in term 4 here, that reserves the right to reject an invoice, up into term 2 and say this is all related to the payment mechanism piece, whereas term 4 is really related to adjustments that may be the result of an adverse finding. So we should separate those two thoughts and make one the more active kind of payment issue, and the other is related more towards what happens if you have an adverse audit finding that somehow impacted a cost that you may be charged to a federal grant XYZ time ago. So what we came up with as a group was to change, to take out the last line of term 4, as you see here, and then in term 2 to change the first sentence. And now we think that this might be a little bit controversial, so we wanted to talk to you about it, is to change the action from the PTE's payment to the subrecipient's submission of invoices. Subrecipients shall submit invoices not more often than monthly and not less frequently than quarterly for allowable costs. Again, this goes to the issue that we have a lot of subrecipients out there, and it's not necessarily always our FDP members, but it may be a lot of the people that we work with that are not FDP members, and they are not submitting invoices on a time frame because it's not stated there that you have to do that. And then upon the receipt of timely invoices, the PTE agrees to process payments in accordance with this subaward and 2 CFR 200.305. Now, the right to reject an invoice also includes some of the information about payment timeline, which includes that 30-day, we need to pay it within 30 days. So that kind of resolves a piece of the issue with when the PTE needs to make the payment, but it also, what we're trying to do here is make it really clear as the subrecipient, to participate in the whole process of subrecipient monitoring, you've got to be sending those invoices. So we're hoping that this also in a way helps with the subrecipient monitoring process, because we're giving some sort of a timeline that you need to be hearing from your subrecipients on their financial piece. They need to be submitting invoices to you at least quarterly. So what do people think about this as a potential issue or solution? I
gave a thumbs up.
I've got. Is there a comment? Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just wondered if you would consider having a checkboxes for monthly or quarterly, because sometimes your crime board requires a monthly payment for being.
Well, that would be attachment 4.
I think that would go, maybe that would go into attachment 4 under the special terms section. And I think as well, for most, I don't want to say all, for most subawards, the federal government isn't requiring us to draw down or make payments or request payments or invoice on a monthly or versus quarterly basis. That might be more driven by a PTE, which is a whole separate issue, but Pamela.
I really like the first sentence. I think that's very helpful. I don't have 305 memorized, but I think it says upon receipt of proper invoice, we will make payment.
Right.
And you know, then it goes into the proper being consistent with the terms and conditions that, you know. And so I don't know if we can put timely in that second sentence, because I think we have to pay out of, from 305, whether it's timely or not, but we could put proper, and then if timely fell into proper, we would have it that way, but it would be closer, I think, to the actual language, without looking it up.
Yeah.
I can't tell for sure, but I think.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So we could definitely change the timely to proper. Another comment over there, yes.
And internally, for proper, we would use the term payable,
Right.
which is more palatable.
Right. And we do have some qualifiers here about some that somewhat go with that. Proper invoices, it gives you a little bit of context here for what proper invoice is. So yeah, that would. Yes, Laura.
So would proper then encompass if we have a soft close and will not be able to get funding if the invoice is so late that we cannot pay it?
That kind of goes to the next.
Cover that situation?
That goes to the next piece, I think, that we're going to talk about. But keep that thought in mind, because I think that is a very important piece. There was a hand in the back. Yes.
For the proposed new text and not less frequently than quarterly, that's not specifically in the uniform guidance, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so then, there's a lot of sub-recipients that do not invoice in a timely manner, what we would call a timely manner. I think that puts a burden on past due entities to make sure they're getting the invoices at that frequency level, which in a way increases the sub-recipient monitoring. Does anybody agree or see what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, this is meant to give more power.
It's ideally, everybody's going to invoice at least quarterly. But if it doesn't happen, and we don't catch it as past due entity, then we're not monitoring.
But you're not monitoring if you're not getting
So
timely invoices.
ideally, I think it looks good, but in practicality, the administering of that could be more burden on some of the tax entities, depending on how people's organizations.
So one of the things, and I think that that's a good point, but I do think that what we're trying to get at here is some sort of contact between the entities. And one of the things that we discussed is if you're not submitting an invoice or you have a $0 invoice, then wouldn't you be in touch at least with your PTE to say, yeah, we didn't submit an invoice to you because we don't have any expenses because we're waiting on our IRB, et cetera. So in a way, some of that would be hopefully mitigated by conversations that are already ongoing between the PTE and their subrecipient. But we could add something in there about if the subrecipient has expenses, they shall submit invoices. So and that might get at some of that, you know. Jen is shaking her head. Okay, we have some thoughts.
I like what you said about the conversations between the prime and the sub, but I think that by inserting that and not less frequently than quarterly, it seems a little overly prescriptive. Because if you have those conversations and say, oh, well, we don't have an IRB or we don't have expenses, you still have that language in there that says, well, you still need to send me a quarterly invoice. And I don't know if you need that. I think you just say monthly. We will know as the prime that we need to follow up on invoicing frequency if they're not coming in. We don't need the language in the agreement to say you have to send me something every quarter.
But if we leave it as monthly, then that doesn't really give any
Because you don't want them doing it too frequently.
Right.
You don't need anything on the other end. You don't need to say you have to send me something.
Okay.
Well, why can't we just put a line about $0, no $0 invoice?
Why couldn't you just
Some
leave it
accounting
out?
departments don't set it up as quarterly though, if they don't have that mandate to say at least quarterly. So if they have a contract that says at least quarterly, they'll set it up in their systems to at least look at it quarterly. If it doesn't say any timeline, it just says not more, or you can only do it not more often than monthly, then there's no restriction as to when you actually have to send the bill.
and they can wait 6 months and still be in compliance with the terms, even though there's costs being incurred every month.
It seems overly prescriptive to me.
Okay, it's a good point.
You know, that greater in terms farther down in the contract, you don't have to have it at this high level, I agree. It's not the same as the quarterly does put the burden on the institution that's doing this work to say, oh, well, they intended this, and I was responsible for following up with them, and letting them know they didn't do this when there may or may not be any cost involved. Now you are, I agree with you. But I think you're really shifting the burden back
Okay.
on the front, if necessary.
Sure.
Saying I don't want them any more than every month. But
Yeah.
somebody doesn't send you one for 7 months, they don't have any expenses. And or are we assuming that they don't want to send us these invoices if they want to do it? I would think they're going to send us an invoice.
That's a good comment, but Laura, you had one other thought, and then we have to move on.
So they're not invoicing, they're not performing work.
Right, and that has been, that was part of the reason that we tried to do that. So Laura, but that's.
So along the lines of what the Air Force was even presenting is that they're watching when you draw down. So if we're not getting invoices in a timely manner, and I don't know if everybody is as siloed as we are with this, which is large of an institution, you have some department managers that are great about the communication, you have some that are less so. And so what we're running into a problem with is that we're getting all the way to the end of the project, and we haven't drawn down those expenses, so the vets think that we don't have that money. But for your, to your point of prescriptiveness, what if we move a portion of this into attachment 4 and we give you the option of the time frame in which you're requiring invoices? If people want to do quarterly or if they want to leave it out entirely, then we leave it to the pass-through entity of what they want identified. And that way, if you don't care about having that language in there, it's gone. But if you're an institution that really needs to crack down on that and we want them quarterly or notification if you haven't incurred any expenses, then you would have that option as well.
Yeah, I think for some institutions, though, if they were to be told, oh, we have to submit it only quarterly, then it kicks it out of their automated invoicing process. And so we would have to just make sure that we structure the language broadly enough to account for some of the automated invoicing. Sheila, and then we have to move on.
Yeah, it would take it out of the automated invoicing process, and even if you put that $0 amount, if, like, for instance, we have a $500 threshold where if we have below that,
Right.
in a month, we won't invoice, we'll just be fine.
Okay.
So I don't know if even the $0 would allay that.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Okay, great, thank you.
For $0 though, isn't invoice different from financial report? So
Right.
I can see a financial report would be still required with $0, but
Right.
it's an invoice that needs to be or something.
Right, yep. Well, we wouldn't require $0 invoices. I don't think that would be
But to
something.
say that the language needs that explanation of $0, I don't think that's necessary for the same invoice.
Right, okay. Okay, so this goes back to one of the points that somebody was raising earlier. The second issue that we wanted to talk about was late invoices. This is in term 3 of the face page. Some folks wanted to add, so we have kind of 2 separate issues. One is the question of how late is too late. We have a lot of institutions that are submitting invoices, and not necessarily in this room, but just in general. So subrecipients are submitting their invoices really late to the PTE, and it's not 65 days after the end of the period of performance. It's 90 to 180 to 200 plus that they're submitting those final invoices. And of course, we want to pay our colleagues, we want to make sure that we're making things right. But I think some institutions are saying, well, wait a minute, I've already closed out this federal award, the closeout has already happened, and now I'm getting this invoice. I'm essentially either having to go, try and go back to the government, or I'm going to have to pay this out of my own pocket. How do we deal with that? So one of the suggestions that we received was late final invoices may not be paid consistent with applicable federal awarding agency regulations. So if the feds have already closed out the award, then that invoice may not be eligible for payment. Okay, we have a love it. Do we have a hate it?
Can I ask a question?
We have a question, yes.
What additional protection does that give you? I mean, my experience is still, we'll just get turned over as a legal matter and you'll get sued for it.
I mean, that could still happen, but you have that we may not be able to pay it from the federal award, so it may, you know, we say in there that 60 days, yes.
I mean, right, as the language stands right now, you can reject an invoice if someone says it at day 61. You still have that right. If the language makes people feel more comfortable at doing that, but you really do. I just think that we don't do it because we have these collegial relationships with one another. And that's really what saves it, is the PI saying, don't harm my other PI.
Right. There was a comment over there.
Is it really necessary? Because you're supposed to be monitoring all the time. So I'm just saying with this that you might not be monitoring.
You might be. Okay, so yes, there's the one comment back there. Bob?
Doesn't this also just tie into the term 2 that we just looked at?
Right.
That if people are invoicing in a timely manner, there should be issued with the final invoice?
Right. Yep. So I mean, so then we're going to post all of this stuff on the listservs, and people can kind of give a final yay or nay by institution on them. But that's absolutely right. You know, like I think in a lot of
I'm not sure if I agree with your comment about the monitoring, because it's not just the initial invoice, but it could be a repetition of the previous invoice or something like that. Where even though you've been monitoring them continually or something, and invoice saying, oops, we never billed for that one particular month, even though we sent you a bill, it didn't include part of the cost. So
right.
I agree that we should have something in there about late invoices. I'm just not sure that we should put it in appendix 4 to just have the PPE determine how late it's going to be.
Okay. One more comment, and then we're going to move on.
I guess I just don't understand why the final invoice stays the final invoice stays. So
right.
You're kind of in breach of contract if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So I feel like adding this then gives less room for us to stand strong if we need to because of a particular situation. To say, well, you didn't get it in 60 days.
Okay. Okay. Those are good comments. The second kind of issue that ties to this is the project period final invoice versus an annual final invoice. So right now we have end date. So a final statement of cumulative cost must be submitted no later than 60 days after the subaward, and right now it says end date, which is nowhere at the top of the page. We have project period and we have, I think, budget period. And so I think that was part of the discussion as well, is people are getting caught in this loop of they didn't know that they needed to submit an annual final. They didn't know that whether it was project or annual. So we were thinking that maybe the way to clarify that is to tie it to those fields back up at the top. Annual budget period, right? So if you're requiring an annual final invoice, it's probably an award where carryover is restricted, versus end of project period, where you're assuming that carryover is not restricted, or you're just going to let that subrecipient roll forward with those expenses. So would that be helpful as a change to have that drop down? Yep.
I think it would be helpful to make it clear when it is something that has to be with an annual report. But I also think that you have the other checkbox about is carry forward approval required, yes or no. So if you say no, maybe you could have a thing there that says whether or not you have to send a final invoice in. Most of the time you would.
Right. Okay.
I mean, maybe it should be clarified there.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
I feel like maybe institutions would have to tie the carry forward approval to the final invoice.
Right.
They wouldn't be able to produce an annual final if carry forward was automatic. That it would be burdensome for their accounting systems.
Right.
So we can program the template so that if you selected annual budget period, it would automatically select carry forward restricted.
Yeah. So we can do that.
So that you're not having to do it twice and you can have it together.
Okay. Okay. other question that had come up, do I have time for this, or we have to move
I'd
on?
say go through the termination, and then we're going to spin through the working groups. I might have to spin through it, and then
Okay.
we leave 15 minutes for carryover.
Okay. So some folks wanted to add some detail about termination. The question came up, should we address the provision of work completed through the date of termination and the return of any materials? Right now, we just have an either party may terminate the subaward upon 30 days written notice provision in the agreement, and no detail is provided. And then we've had some questions come up about whether or not we should say anything about providing the work completed through the date of termination, the return of any materials that were provided to the subrecipient. So should we address that? If we did, would we put it in attachment 2, attachment 4? Or is this really not a frequent occurrence and people think that an FAQ about this would suffice? FAQ? FAQ?
That's
okay.
my work group.
There we go. Stephanie, I just gave you some more work. Great. Okay, and then if we have time at the end, we can come back and do the 3A, 3B.
Okay. We're going to just go through working groups. Okay, so if you're a working group lead, I'm probably going to read your slide for you because we need to leave enough time to talk about the carryover survey. So Alice Ruther, raise your hand. She's been doing a great job leading the foreign templates working group that is full speed ahead. They've been making a lot of content changes, specifically the cost reimbursement template. It's gone through a complete overhaul. It's going to mirror our regular domestic templates, and a guidance document is also in the process of being developed and reviewed to accompany it. So you know actually how to use these templates. On the face page, Alice gave some summary bullets here of what the significant items that are going to be changed. I'm just going to quickly go through this. You know what, I don't think I want to have, we have a lot of time to go through every bullet, but this is a summary of what the significant changes are. Alice, do you want me to state anything significant with this, or?
No, just that we are going to share the template for feedback, to hear from you if we are missing something that you would like to be added to the following template. We are going to share it with the community, to the listener, open for comments and suggestions. And the template is going to be selecting the agency, like the attachment 2, just going to mirror what we have to the rest. So please send all your comments, the email that we send out is going to say the deadlines and everything. So make sure you comment on them so we can capture the data elements that we want to be included, that we can work on that.
Wonderful. And to contact you if they have any questions. Wonderful. I know Ken is here. Raise your hand, Ken Packman. Hi. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to really quickly go through it. So Ken and Ray Schofield have been leading the subcontract sample. And so we actually do have it if you have used it before. It hasn't been updated since September 2013. And they are in the process of updating that template as well when the prime award is a federal contract. I know that they've had several meetings as 11 members on their committee. And that is also on its way. Any questions? You can talk to Ken or Ray. The Rat Cat. So that group has been moving along. It was resurrected. Sarah Clough has been leading the direction on that, working very closely with the FTP Expanded Clearinghouse. We're doing a full circle there where they're in the process of developing a financial questionnaire for those entities that are not subject to single audit. And so it's supposed to tie into the Clearinghouse. If you go to that session, you'll hear more about that. But at the end of the day, we want to simplify the rack and the cat to then all tie together to the Clearinghouse. And it's all going to be one great thing. Moving on. You might have heard from the last FDP meeting, we clarified with NIH that they now do require, they removed the waiver that they had in place through an FAQ in the grants policy statement. They now require prior approval if you plan to issue a fixed price subaward. We have a new working group actually developing template language on that to be included in proposals, or if you needed to do a prior approval separately. But that group is also having some more discussion about its impact on clinical trials, and especially when clinical trials are to be named and not yet named. So if you have any questions about that, or you're interested in participating in that discussion, talk to Jennifer McAllister and Duke. And then finally,
So we kind of talked a lot about what Laura and I and the rest of our wonderful committee have been working on, the subaward template. We've had a lot of really great discussions and great feedback. We'd received, I think, over 105 comments from the user community. So going through that has taken us slightly longer than we had anticipated, but we are chugging along, and hopefully the next template will be so great that we'll have like 5 comments.
Awesome.
Okay.
Don't follow the email because that's not my email address.
Oh no. Sorry, I'll change it, and when we post the slides, I'll change it before we do that. Sorry about that. Okay. We're here.
The moment you've been waiting for, the carryover survey. Thank you for all that participated. I just want to say we only had a chance to review this and the data yesterday, so this is preliminary. We're not doing anything special in SPSS or doing chi-squares or regression analysis. This is just simple, down and dirty raw data of what we've gotten.
So we received 97 responses. Not everyone responded to all of the questions, so sometimes when you're looking at the numbers on the next few slides, you'll be like, wait, that's not 97. That's why. We do plan to reach out to the working group that's been working with us on carryover to follow up on next steps, walk through the data with them, and have more to report in September. I will have the raw data available upon request with the institution names taken out, but the raw feedback there. So here are some things that we have seen. So how many restrict carryover by default? 18 out of 97 restrict by default. 79 out of 97 do not generally restrict unless the sponsor requires or is required by maybe their risk assessments, et cetera, as we see in the next part.
All right, and how many of you are restricting carryover based on conducting a risk assessment? So 11 out of the 96 responses said, yes, we do that, we'll restrict it. And 62 out of 96, which I thought was pretty high, that sometimes they'll do it. So in other words, these 62 responses are saying, you know what, we will restrict carry forward, and looking at the type of situation there is if they're being high risk, that's something that we would do. However, 16 out of the 96 responses, they'll still allow you automatic carryover even if you didn't do so well in the risk assessment. And then 7 out of the 96 kind of gave other explanations, but a lot of them were about the PI wanting more control. So in reading through those responses, it had to do with the PI wanting more control over it.
And then in terms of how people actually restrict, 14 out of 96 answered that they issue new subawards every single year. And then 74 out of 96 indicated they still go ahead and issue mods. And 8 out of 96 selected other, but they didn't specify what they did. So maybe they just don't issue anything.
Yeah, well, this was really interesting to me because I didn't realize that so many institutions were just still issuing mods and not new agreements this year. I could tell you my institution, we used to issue new agreements every year when we restricted carryover. And so even before the survey came out, we were moving away from that practice and we're starting to do mods. So I didn't realize how many were actually doing it that way. And then how many overall have restricted subs? Oh yeah, so overall, how many of your subs have you restricted? So 71 out of the 96 responses said they do it on less than 25% of the subawards that they issue. Only 7 out of the 96 restricted, like between a quarter and half of their subs. One said they do it, between 51 and 75%. And then 17, as you can imagine, those are probably the ones that do by default restrict it on 75% or more of their subs. Right? Oh, yeah. And then the final one, how involved do you want us to get in this?
So 4 out of the 89 responses we got on this that were specific, 4 institutions indicated, now this was an open entry field, so this is kind of generally us looking at it and saying, do we think they seem positive or negative about this? So 4 seem to be on the fence. 13 out of those 89 think that we should just remain neutral. 39 out of 89 advocate for the FDP to strongly encourage but not mandate, and then 33 out of 89 seem to be advocating for us to mandate that carryover be allowed when the federal awarding agency allows it, as between FDP institutions, just as a qualifier there, I would say.
All right. So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Initial reactions.
Any thoughts?
Yeah.
Turn it back to that.
If you go back to your one more, where,
This one?
yeah, so if this is how you ask the question on risk assessment, I'm not reading the 16 as a no, as necessarily they didn't care if it was higher risk, right? You've asked your risk assessment, like, are you considering risk assessment high or low? Like, you're making an evaluation, but your question doesn't say, if you evaluated them as high risk, are you restricting them?
Well, that's not the actual question from the survey. That's just kind of
This is all
indicative
summary,
of the,
right.
yeah, summary. Yes.
Was there a question about multi-PI?
There was not a question about multi-PI, because we didn't want to get into.
We didn't want to get too complex with this, right?
Yes, in the back.
Yes,
Cooley.
I think that the carry forward restrictions should only apply when the sponsor requires it.
Right.
And I certainly do not think that the PI should ever be the driver of whether we apply the carry forward restriction. Because the agreement is between institutions and not between the PI and us, or some.
That's interesting.
We've got
Bouncers. Where are
at
you?
the ready.
Go ahead.
Totally agree with that position. The pass-through PI, the PTE PI has to keep an eye on the overall budget and has to be able to manage the funds of the overall budget. So we would take that input.
Yep.
I was just going to ask,
And then-
have you been considered, or are you thinking about, if you decide, to the point of the last question, to either mandate or make it so, how you might help institutions talk to OIG auditors coming in about sub-recipient monitoring? Because that's going to be a big issue if this is something that all FDP institutions, per the templates, decide that carry forward is automatic, and the OIG, when they do those sub-recipient monitoring audits, decide.
Automatic if the prime award is automatic and if it's kind of clear of any risk.
Right.
So I think that we would still, no matter what, say, hey, pass-through entity, as a result of conducting a risk assessment, if there are concerns, which is a programmatic or an entity risk, then I think pass-through entity should still have that flexibility to restrict the carryover.
So what we're talking about when we talk about having a mandate is really this is your blanket business process. We just restrict. But I mean, I think the data at this point is telling us that that's not a direction that would be right for the group at this time, for us just to come out and mandate that. Yes.
Yep.
I think we have to reserve the right to impose carry forward restrictions when there's specific good and valid reasons for doing that.
Right.
But in all other cases, I think we should be guided by the golden rule. Remember, what you do unto us, we will.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's Jessica.
I think in regards to going back to not letting the PI just say, carry forward, there's also there's high-risk institutions where you might want to consider. There may be high-risk sub-recipient PIs, where it's not just one PI being unreasonable, but actually this person has an issue. And there needs to be some sort of a mechanism to flag high-risk sub-recipient PIs.
And I think that that's something that each institution can determine for themselves, but I think if we ever did come out with our guidance will say, PTEs, you always have the right to impose carryover. We encourage you, however, to think about how you structure that. So whether, if your institution is blanket, and that's what's right for your institution, we're, not going to come out and say that you have to change it. But I think what we're trying to open the conversation is to say, are there other methods that are equally effective for institutions, so that carryover is just kind of one tool in the bucket and not the only tool? Because right now I think it feels a little bit like this is the way that we have to control the performance and the progress of our subrecipient. But are there other more effective tools that may be used, like offsets or milestone budgets, et cetera, that if we were to provide a little bit more guidance and a little bit more information on how those could be used as a management tool, then a PI at an institution might elect to do milestones if they're really concerned about that subrecipient PI or offsetting. Yes, one last comment.
Last one. Yep.
I think that it's just important as we try to educate these other universities that are doing it to make sure that we're communicating to them how significant an administrative burden it is. I think that a lot of those institutions are probably pretty out of touch on the financial management side of it and what it means to set up a new account every single year for a project when it's not necessary, and what that means, not just at the central level, but at the departmental level for the PIs and for students and everybody, and how it's a huge trickle down of additional burden. And I think that we maybe need to develop something that's very like, as an example, this small decision on your part, which could be easily mitigated this way, is causing a huge amount of administrative burden.
So we do have that.
We do have that in our draft guidance, which we never showed you guys, but we do have draft guidance on this where we strongly and explicitly explain this. Since I know we're completely out of time, as you can see in the data, it was really close, the strongly encourage versus the mandate, but obviously I think we're going to be leaning more toward the strongly encourage.
Right.
And in terms of next steps, I think it's
we've already
writing the summary of the results.
Yep.
Meeting with this work group again, and issuing the draft carryover guidance.
Right. And we did approve at the last meeting in January a change. We're going to move carryover to attachment 4, and we're also going to have a drop down that indicates who is requiring that carryover restriction. Is it a result of the PTE? Is it the result of the federal awarding agency? And we will provide recommendations or guidance that suggest that when you do it as an institution and you're doing it for a specific reason, that you include some of that information in your transmission to the subrecipient. And with that, if you have any questions, call us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys.